for being with us once again here on WESN. Well, with the talk of war, and in some cases harsh words being thrown around by leaders in the region, we thought we'd get a perspective on that from someone who has contributed significantly to the public discussion in the public space about matters having to do with regional unity, with the regional community in the Caribbean. He used to be at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine for a number of years. He's now operating as a professor at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. We asked him what are his thoughts on what is happening in the region as we speak. Professor Andy Knight. Good to have you with us, sir.
Thank you very much, Andy, and it's a pleasure to be with you, to see you, and to be able to say a few words about what's going on in the Caribbean. As you know, I've tried to keep in touch with what's happening. Even though I left since 2016 back to Canada, but you know, I'm very. As you know, we've always considered the Caribbean. Now this seems to be under review by the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, and all the other leaders seem to have accepted and embraced the notion of a zone of peace for the region, because they understand that any war, any conflict in the region will interrupt trade, will interrupt tourism, will interrupt the way in which the Caribbean states are trying to govern the presence of the U.S. military, even although we have had the U.S. presence before in the region. With SOFA, for example, it gives is an agreement between Caribbean countries and the United States that the United States could actually assist where Caribbean states may not have the capacity to deal with issues such as crime, transnational crime, transnational drug trafficking, etc., and human trafficking. This is a completely different situation. What we have here today is a U.S. president who, having, helping the Caribbean states deal with these issues of drugs and transnational criminal activity, but a president who is intent on seeing regime change in Venezuela, and in this game, which is very terrifying, I think, for many people in the Caribbean. So I am very concerned, and I think a lot of other colleagues of mine are also concerned that this can lead to perhaps an unwitting war in the region, which will not be of any benefit at all to the Caribbean countries.
Okay, let's take the last couple of days, for example. Do you think that the tone of the back and forth and of the statements, either from the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, from the people in Trinidad and Tobago who aren't in agreement with what she's saying and what she's doing, the people in the United States, the President and his team, let's talk about that, how in some cases people are living every day, taking it one day at a time. People are scared, I was going to use the term after that, but to the bone in Trinidad and Tobago and elsewhere in the Caribbean as we speak.
Yeah. It's unfortunate, because I can still remember the days when you and I and others were helping to give advice to the Prime Minister in her first time around. And it seems as though she's gotten advice from different people now. And the advice is not very good advice, because it's causing her to feel a kind of empowerment, I guess, to utilize the same kind of language that President Trump has been using with respect to dealing with challenges in the region. When she talks about killing every one of them, meaning the drug traffickers that may have been killed in attacks by U.S. warships. This is not the kind of language that we expect from the Prime Minister. we expect her to be much more diplomatic in her tone, and also we expect her to adhere to international legal standards. And what's happening, with this what I call extrajudicial killing in the region and of the Caribbean Sea, and in the region just outside of the Caribbean Sea, this is a violation of international law. There's no question about that in my mind. And I think the U.S. president has to be held to account for this kind of activity. Now, it seems to me that while Caribbean people are being concerned with what the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago is doing, it's clear that she is complicit, right, with this activity. She is actually almost like a cheerleader for the United States in this kind of activity. And this is very, very scary and very frightening for a lot of people in the region. We respect Trinidad and Tobago tremendously because it's one of the larger countries in the region. Its contribution from Eric Williams on to the present has been one of contributing to what we call regionalism in the Caribbean. It has a leadership role to play in the region, but certainly what's happening right now is not doesn't give it sort of tarnishes the reputation, let's put it that way, of the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, but also tarnishes the reputation of the country itself, which will no longer be regarded as a leader in the region if it continues to be complicit with what the United States president is doing. So I'm very concerned, I'm very saddened actually that that we've gone in that direction, and I wish that she would take advice from other leaders and other people within the country who might be calling for a much more sober and diplomatic approach to this problem.
Let's talk about the principle about a zone of peace. The Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago seemed to take an issue with that, or not pay sufficient attention to what it means and what it sets out to establish. If in fact the idea of a zone of peace has not already sort of been cemented in the minds of a lot of people in the region, whether they're in government, whether they're in politics, or as ordinary citizens, the idea that this is an area in which war and military hostilities would not take place among people in the administrations or populations in the area, or from outside, the question of a zone of peace. She seemed to challenge what that means at this stage, at this point.
That, you know what, that's one of the surprising things for me, because I was of the impression that Trinidad and Tobago was one of the Caribbean countries in CARICOM that has supported the idea of a zone of peace. The previous administration, Trinidad and Tobago, certainly did. And even when I was there in Trinidad from 2013 to 2016, I believe, the Prime Minister, to me, had embraced the idea of a zone of peace in any public statements that she had made. I can still remember the big celebration of CSME and the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the regionalization of the Caribbean, and she was held in high esteem by the other members of the Caribbean countries because she was in line with that notion of a zone of peace, and so I'm very surprised by this. She's saying that maybe the rest of the Caribbean countries have a zone of peace, but maybe in Trinidad they can't see that because there are more killings on the islands of Trinidad and Tobago. There are a higher rate of killing, a higher rate of murders and so on happening, and she thinks a lot of this has to do with the influence of Venezuela in the region, maybe the influence of other cartels coming into the country. But the reality is, I think Trinidad and Tobago has a problem with crime, and it doesn't really matter which prime minister is in power, which political parties in power. This is a perpetual problem in Trinidad and Tobago, having a lot to do with underlying social challenges of the country. Those are the things that she should be concerned about. Those are the things that she should be working on, rather than encouraging some sort of external body like the United States to come in to try to solve this problem for Trinidad. It's not going to solve the problem for Trinidad. Trinidad is still going to have the same kind of challenges internally, right, with crime and the escalation of crime and human trafficking and drug trafficking, etc. The presence of guns, for example, much more prevalent in Trinidad than almost any other country in the region. So this is something that I think is part of the domestic politics of Trinidad and Tobago that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, because
bringing in the United States into this will not solve the problem.
Yeah, and there's I think a substantive difference between crime and violence and the idea of war and peace. So that
yes. Yes, there is. Yeah. And, you know, wars are usually declared, right? And wars are declared against the enemy. When the enemy happens to be individuals within the country, or happen to be people residing within Trinidad and Tobago or coming into the island of Trinidad and Tobago, I don't really consider that to be a war situation unless it's declared. The United States has not declared a war with Venezuela. What it has done is engaged in this extrajudicial killing. I cannot help but emphasize that enough. This is outside the parameters of what we consider to be the laws of war. This is outside the parameters of what is required to deal with drug trafficking. Even if the charges of drug trafficking are correct, this does not require a military position on this issue. There are other ways of dealing with this: arresting the individuals, bringing them to trial, having them account for their crimes in a court of law. That's the correct legal way to deal with this. And I think we've gotten away from that notion to believe somehow that, you know, the big stick is always going to work in every situation. It's almost like a carpenter thinking that the entire job of the carpenter is to use a hammer. There are many times when a screwdriver would do, when a plane would do, when different type of tools might be used to deal with the job of the carpenter. Using the hammer only can be very destructive and not necessarily good in terms of constructing a home. So I think that the Prime Minister ought to be able to work with her colleagues in CARICOM. This would be my advice from a distance. Work with her colleagues in CARICOM to see how best to address these kinds of problems that can have, yes, they can have transnational impacts. You know, a crime in Trinidad can have transnational impacts as people decide to maybe leave the island to go somewhere else. I mean, that's how migration happens. And also, I think we need to bring those kind of criminal activity under control. Yes, but there's a way of doing this that involves strengthening our judicial system, strengthening our police forces, strengthening our border agencies, strengthening our intelligence to be able to identify who these individuals are, these perpetrators of crime are. It's a completely different situation altogether to get involved in a war-like situation in the region. That's not called for. That's not wanted by any of the countries in the region. So I'm very concerned by this, and I think we need to turn the ship around a little bit if we're going to survive as small island states in the region.
Yeah, and the idea of the principle of due process, that seems to have been thrown by the wayside in what we're witnessing.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You know, we pride ourselves, especially as small island states, we pride ourselves on the notion of due process, bringing individuals who have committed crimes or are suspected of committing crimes through the judicial process. They have a right to answer to the charges that are laid before them. We have the right to arrest individuals who may be perpetrating crimes in our countries. But what we don't have is a right to sort of bypass that due process and bypass international law and even domestic law, for that matter, to deal with this kind of situation. Even the U.S., I think that there are now members of Congress that are starting to be critical of the president's actions off the coast of Venezuela and what he's doing to countries in the region by involving them in this conflict with Venezuela. They're saying that the president has never brought the issue to Congress. It's never been approved. Usually wars are usually approved by the Congress. It's a congressional issue. And the president has a lot of authority as president to get involved in these kinds of skirmishes, but he has to get some sort of blanket agreement among people within Congress who are elected by the people to put the country in that kind of warlike state. But this is not happening in this case, and I think this is very troubling even for people within the United States.
Yeah, and there was some reporting to the point that possibly the U.S. president could find himself going before the International Criminal Court for some of this activity, the decisions on how he's ordered what has been happening. Yeah,
you know, one of the things that I hope the president is paying attention to what's happening, say, with the Philippines and what's happening with the former president of the Philippines, because there is a possibility that the United States leadership, and particularly the Trump administration, could be brought before the International Criminal Court because he's violating international law. This is clear violation of international law. One might even argue this is a crime against humanity to wipe out individuals just simply because you suspect them of being drug traffickers. There's no evidence to show that these individuals are drug traffickers. The Colombian president talks about an individual from Colombia who was being killed by one of these strikes, who was an ordinary fisherman. How do we know that some of these individuals aren't simply trying to make a living being a fisherman in the region? We need to be able to find that information out. We cannot just be killing people without knowing exactly who they are, where they're from, what kind of connections they have to drug trafficking or criminal elements in the region. We have to be able to produce the evidence to support that kind of thing before you start, unilaterally killing individuals. So I wouldn't be surprised if, and I think it's going to happen, where the president of the United States is actually brought before, or not necessarily brought before, but actually charged with international crimes, which would mean that if he's arrested, he could be brought before the International Criminal Court and tried. Many people thought that Milosevic in the former Yugoslavia would never account for his crimes against the people in his country before it was finally broken up into 3 different countries. But he was arrested eventually. Many people thought that Charles Taylor of Liberia would never have been arrested by an international tribunal and charged, but he was eventually arrested and tried. So I know the United States is a big country. I know that it has hegemonic aspirations. I know that it's much more difficult to bring someone like the President of the United States to court, international body. But he's not always going to be President of the United States. In his capacity as a private individual, once he leaves the office, he could be arrested and tried for these crimes that are being committed right now.
Yeah, and at least I'm not sure I want to call it a crime, but I think the misapprehension about what he's doing could land the Trinidad and Tobago Prime Minister in some trouble for supporting that kind of action, regardless of what the motivation for it is. Correct?
Yes, and that's a very big concern for me. Is a kind of complicity that at least people are starting to see with the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, supporting, and not only supporting the president on this international criminal activity, but also being a cheerleader almost for what he is doing. That puts him in the category of being a complicit individual. So she could also be considered to be a person who violated international law through her support for what the president is doing. And I think she should be concerned by that. I don't know who's giving her advice, legal advice, but someone should be telling her that this is not good for the prime minister as an individual, and it's not good for the country as a whole. I think she's getting very bad advice.
Yeah. So the idea, I say the sort of philosophy and principle of a zone of peace is that, but some people seem to want to question what it means. And so it means that, well, you lay it out as best you can, for my understanding and for other people's understanding. Mm-hmm. What does it mean? Because there has been some challenge to that statement. What is a zone of peace?
Well, this is a very good question, right? Any zone of peace is basically a statement by the collective, the people within that zone, that region, that they would like to see that place avoid clashes, military clashes, not have the presence of the military in that area unless permission is given by the entire region. This is usually a collective decision by all the countries in the region to adhere to principles of a zone of peace, and that means that if there is a war breaking out, hopefully that region would avoid having to go through the negative aspects of the war, and I don't understand why this is not front and center in the Prime Minister's mind right now, because we can hardly afford, I don't think, the Caribbean countries, small island states, facing multiple challenges with pandemics and climate change activity that could actually be devastating, as we saw recently with Melissa in Jamaica, hurricanes and floods and all these disasters that can happen to small island developing states. We can hardly afford not to have a zone of peace. And I think that should be the concern for all Caribbean leaders right now. So why not get together with the region and recommit yourself to something that you've already committed yourself to, which is an agreement that this region will be a zone of peace. It protects travel to to the countries in the region. It protects tourism. It protects trade relations, whether you're trading with countries in the region or outside the region. If you have a zone of peace, it brings about a kind of a security, a kind of a sense of calm and equilibrium in the region. And I think that should be something that we should all want to strive for.
Yeah, what do you know of the sentiments either being occupied and held or portrayed and conveyed by other leaders in the region about what is happening and about the positions that you outlined, some of them, being taken by the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago? How do her colleagues up the region feel? Yeah. As best as you know and can analyze.
Yeah. Well, I've been following very closely the Prime Minister of Barbados, because I think she's probably the most articulate leader of the region right now in terms of trying to explain to the region what this means for the Caribbean. And she's, of course, a very strong supporter of federalism in the region. And I think her voice echoes and reflects what the other members of CARICOM are feeling right now about this situation. And Prime Minister Mia Mottley, has been very clear that she supports, and the other members of the Caribbean community support the idea of a zone of peace. She does not like the kind of rhetoric that's coming out of Trinidad and Tobago right now that sort of criticizes or even made a suggestion that there could not be a zone of peace in the region, because That's not what the rest of the Caribbean countries feel. Even a little bit of outlier because of, its largesse right now in oil and gas. But even Guyana is pretty supportive of. There's some challenges with what the Prime Minister of Jamaica is saying and doing along these lines as well. But I don't think that he has actually supported anything other than the zone of peace for the region. So I think most Caribbean countries, they depend very heavily on trade. They depend very heavily on the smooth movement of people between the countries of the region. It's all part of the CSME and CARICOM's goal and vision for the region. I think the progressive regionalization is something that most Caribbean leaders are in favor of. So this makes Trinidad really an outlier among all the Caribbean countries right now.
Do you think that relations, one leader to another, one country to another, at the political level, do you think those relations are strained as we speak?
That the relations between countries,
yes,
are strained? Yes, I think it has. I think it's strained, and I'm very concerned that this kind of thinking, where one country a very substantial country in the Caribbean, decides to take a position that's different from the rest. I remember that statement that was signed by all the CARICOM countries, and Trinidad and Tobago simply refused to sign on to that statement. That was an indication that there's a kind of a rift going on in CARICOM. My concern is that the actions of the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago may actually lead to further risks later on in the region. So this is very concerning. Instead of strengthening CARICOM, instead of trying to move beyond greater regionalization of countries in the region, we might have this friction that develops with everybody deciding that they want to have their own self-interest ahead of the interests of the region as a whole. And that defeats the whole principle behind regionalization. If you go back to the European Union, for example, Brexit was an example of that kind of split that happened in that regionalization. That was not very healthy for either Britain or for Europe. And I think what Trinidad is doing right now is very unhelpful to anyone who believes in the regionalization of the Caribbean. And I'm certainly a strong supporter of that. I don't know if you remember the book I wrote with two colleagues talking about remapping the Americas. And that book, Remapping the Americas, is a textbook that's being used in Canada right now for regionalization. And it was seen as a good thing that I did the research, that countries in the Caribbean were starting to find ways to strengthen the bonds between them, as opposed to right now tearing it apart. So I'm very concerned that we're moving away from that notion of the regional Caribbean, this very strong region. Sometimes that's the only way that we can survive as small island states. It's to pool our resources together, to pool our sovereignty together in a kind of a CARICOM way in which we've done in the past. So I think we have to get back to that notion again.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about West Indians in the part of the world you are now. How are the rest of them, if not including yourself, dealing with this issue all these hundreds of miles away? But in a lot of cases,
yes.
Go ahead.
We have of course we have a very strong Caribbean contingents in Canada, and I think they're very concerning. I just wrote a piece for the Caribbean Camera, which is one of the most popular Caribbean media outlets in Toronto, and it's about the same problem. I think people want to know what's happening. They're very, very disturbed by what's happening in Trinidad and Tobago. Even Trinidadians in Canada, they cannot figure out what's going on. First of all, they're very concerned. We are very concerned as a country with what Trump has been trying to do to Canada. The imposition of tariffs, the notion that somehow Canada could become the 51st state of the United States. And there's a huge pushback in Canada against this. I can tell you from looking around the grocery stores that people aren't buying U.S. products anymore in the grocery stores. They're just sitting on the shelves and rotting, the vegetables and so on, coming from the United States. So there is a real pushback against this idea that somehow the United States can act as this unwieldy bull in a china shop, going into countries and trying to impose sanctions on trade relations in those countries. So people are very mystified by this. I'm very upset. I'm very concerned. Even here in Canada, miles away from Trinidad and Tobago, they're very concerned. So I think if you look at the diaspora, you'll see evidence of this, that there are kind of shocked that the Trinidad and Tobago Prime Minister is taking the road that she has done. Even in terms of the relationship with Venezuela, because as you would remember, I think, Andy, and I think you were one of the people in the room that helped to carve statements for the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago with respect to our relationship with Maduro. At that time, she was a big fan of Maduro. I know she'd make a 360-degree turn in which she now considers Maduro to be next to Satan, I guess. It's just amazing to me how that's changed over the course of time. And I think this is very, very unhelpful for the relationship between even Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago. It's very unhelpful because we had such strong ties with the people of Venezuela. Even if you have disagreements with the leadership, there's always been very strong ties with the people of Venezuela. So I think it's going in the wrong direction. I'm sorry to say that, but I think Trinidad and Tobago has taken a completely off-ramp turn, and it's not very helpful for either Trinidad or for the rest of the Caribbean.
All right, so we're gonna have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Professor Andy Knight, bringing us up to date with your perspective and the feelings of Trinidad and Tobago citizens and other West Indian citizens where you are at the moment in Edmonton, Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No problem. Take care.
Professor Andy Knight on how he sees and what he's picking up from other people who are sharing their views on this issue as to current events and current affairs in Trinidad and Tobago vis-a-vis what's happening in the rest of the region with the U.S. Some aggression, some people would say. This has been 10 Questions. I'm Andy Johnson. Thanks for watching. As always, we'll see you next time.
WESN.
FanZone, your reliable, authentic supplier, has just gotten better. You can now visit our website www.fanzonett